So I don't really know where to start this video because with everything that's going on in the world with the coronavirus, COVID-19, it seems very inconsequential to really dig in deep to potentially cancelled fights. But I want to do it anyway because these fights, and one fight in particular, is very near and dear to my heart, and I'm sure very near and dear to your hearts. So let's talk about it. UFC 249 is scheduled to be headlined by Khabib Nurmagomedov defending his lightweight title against Tony Ferguson, finally. And of course, it's been well documented that the UFC have tried to put this fight together 4 times in the past. This is the 5th time, and it looks like it's going to fall out once again. And I don't believe in curses at all, but when you look at the totality of the evidence that we have for Ferguson Khabib, you've got to say that it's cursed. I mean, a while back I done a video on the top 10 biggest disappointments in MMA or something of that sort. And of course Ferguson and Khabib was on that. But as I was writing the list, I just noticed how bizarre each subsequent withdrawal was. And then you get to this point where it's potentially going to be cancelled from a global pandemic. And it's just getting crazier. It's insane. But I think it makes sense to talk about, can the fight actually happen? Is it still viable based on the evidence that we have? And also, should it happen? Because there is a serious discussion about whether it's even ethical. So first, will it happen? My gut feeling is no. And it's not just because the fight is cursed, but I also think if you just look at the evidence that we have, it seems very unlikely. So originally I think there was talk about maybe moving it to the Apex, which is the UFC's like in-house arena where they can hold fights. Of course the Contender Series is held there. But now Nevada have suspended combat sports in the state until March 25th. Of course UFC 249 doesn't happen until the 18th of April, so there is a buffer there. But it's looking increasingly likely that that restriction will be extended. But then you got to think about all the other things that goes into it in terms of, can the fighters even get to Vegas? I know there's many countries with travel restrictions, and of course the US have some travel restrictions. And I'm not sure how that would affect every individual fighter on the card, because I know there are a lot of Americans and South Americans on the card. But you do have some Russians there as well, but maybe they're in the US already. But then you have to look at the fighters themselves, because it's not just about them showing up on fight night. They've got to still train, and we've already seen that multiple gyms have closed. Some are still open for pro fighters, which is okay, but I think some have completely closed even for pro fighters. Then the fighters have to cut weight, which can hurt their immune system, which isn't really ideal with this whole COVID-19 thing going on. Plus we know some fighters on the card have had trouble making weight in the past, and in particular one fighter, Khabib Nurmagomedov, has had quite a bit of trouble in the past making weight. So, you know, that's not ideal either. And then it's just that little problem of the health risk that the fighters will be under, and of course the staff and production people that will be in the arena. Now I know the UFC have said that they're going to go above and beyond to make sure the health of the fighters is a priority, and the health of the rest of the staff, I assume. But based on what we know, people can have coronavirus and not show symptoms for like 3 or 4 days, maybe even 5 days, 6 days, whatever it is. So I'm not so sure that the UFC could be in the clear even if they test every fighter. But who knows? I'm not a doctor, I'm just spitballing. So that brings me to the question of, should the fight happen? And in the court of public opinion, there's no right answer to this question, because there'll be arguments on both sides as to why I'm wrong. But I think the right answer is, it probably shouldn't happen. Now, if you've watched my past videos or the past podcasts, you know that I love this fight and I cannot wait to see it. I'm obsessed with this sport. But when you look at it from an ethical perspective and look at how other sports have dealt with this issue, I think it's hard to make an argument to say that the show must go on, even though I'd love nothing more but to see it. But the thing that really hurts is that if the fight doesn't go ahead, we probably won't get to see this fight, if we ever get to see it, until at least the end of the year, because you have Ramadan coming up and Khabib doesn't fight through Ramadan. It's also guaranteed that this problem is going to last for a while. So I don't know what's going to happen in the meantime. But yeah, it sucks. Then you have the card this weekend, which was supposed to be UFC London. It's UFC London no more, and now it has been indefinitely postponed along with the other fight nights coming up. And that obviously isn't a good omen for Khabib versus Ferguson, but it's kind of crazy that the UFC were so persistent to try keep these fights on. And I understand it from a certain perspective, and I understand it especially from a fighter's perspective, because one of the big statements that the UFC have made is that the fighters want to fight. And of course the fighters, or at least most fighters, want to fight, because if they don't fight, most likely they won't be paid. The UFC are probably under no obligation to pay the fighters. Now I hope that I'm wrong, and I hope that the fighters who had to cancel their fight for UFC London will be paid. So I do understand why the fighters want to fight. And then from a business perspective, it's completely understandable why the UFC want the events to happen. This is their business. And one of the things that Dana White has said throughout this whole week is that it's their job to put on fights. He also said that he runs into these kind of problems constantly in the fight game, which I think is reaching a little bit because this is a pandemic and, you definitely don't run into these type of issues, but that's neither here nor there. So one interesting thing I did see was that Cage Warriors 113, which happens this Friday, has actually taken on one of the fights that was supposed to happen at UFC London. Dusko Todorovic and John Phillips will fight on that card, and Graham Boylan, the president of Cage Warriors, seemed to indicate that maybe there'll be other fights as well. And to be honest, I'm not really sure how I feel about this because on one hand, I think it's a bit egregious for cards to go ahead anyway. Now, if they can guarantee that there was no risks at all, I of course would say 100% do the event. I want to see it. But as I said, there's so many moving parts to this that it's difficult to get behind these cards staying in place. But if this card is going to stay in place and there's nothing that we can do about it, and they can offer fighters a chance to get paid where they wouldn't have got paid, I mean, it's hard to argue against that either. So it's a really strange one. But anyway, moving on, because I want to get to your questions, because in our community tab on YouTube, we usually put up a thread for questions for the podcast. Now, with the coronavirus, it looks like the podcast won't happen, or at least it's not going to happen in the form that we usually do it. The reason for that is because me and Sean, so Sean is my co-host, we actually do the podcast in our mutual workplace. We work together, not in the same team, but for the same company, so in the same building. And we'd usually record the podcast after we finish work, and we have all the equipment there and stuff, so that can't actually happen. What we might try do is try do a podcast from home, if possible, maybe over a Skype call. We'll see. I'll keep you updated on our Twitter or on our YouTube page. But give us your suggestions on what we could do, because maybe we could do even a live chat, which I haven't done in a long time, and I do enjoy doing them. But obviously that depends on the interest and stuff. So let me know in the comments below. But yeah, let's get on to your questions. So first question is from JLo Street. How far do you think Oliveira will go at lightweight? I don't see him beating Gaethje, Hooker or Felder. What do you guys think? So Oliveira for me is a very interesting case because he's a similar one to Masvidal or someone of that ilk who was very good and we knew he was very, very skilled, but didn't really blossom until far into his career. And I think right now he is blossoming. I do agree with your take that there is a lot of guys at lightweight where I would certainly place Oliveira as the underdog if he was to face them. And I don't want to say that he gave up, but the sense that I got from Oliveira was that when he was falling behind, sometimes his desire to win really diminished, and it diminished really quickly. Now, I don't think there was any moment really where he was completely on the back foot against Kevin Lee, but there was a few moments where I thought, man, if this was Oliveira of 145, he'd probably wilt a little bit here. And he didn't. He was strong and he finished strong, and you could see his confidence grow as it went on. So I think he can go quite far in this division. I think he can be a lot of good guys in the division. Now, he did call for Conor McGregor. That's never going to happen, at least not now, unless something drastic happens in both of their careers. But there's a lot of fun fights there, and he does have that X factor of having an insane ground game where he can just catch submissions out of nowhere. And that high wrist guillotine, if you want to call it that, is one of my personal favourite guillotine chokes. It's the one I love to hit the most, closely tied with a high elbow guillotine, although sometimes I have more trouble getting that one. But I did learn a little detail from a John Danaher instructional video online on how to get the high elbow guillotine. I'll post it in the comments if anyone's interested. But essentially, it's when you get the high elbow guillotine, so you have the choke, and obviously you have the high elbow up here, if you want to grab it here, you look in the same direction as where the high elbow is coming, and it allows you to have a little bit more flexibility in getting the choke, because I had a lot of problems with my flexibility. So yeah. Salvastola, do you see any holes in Kevin Lee's submission defense? So that's an interesting question, because normally I'd say no, because Kevin Lee is actually a really good grappler. If you watch how he grapples and you watch basically every phase of his grappling game, he's pretty good. But his major problem here, and the major mistake that he made, and I don't think this has been a major feature of his game in the past, so I'm not sure if I'd call it a hole, was that on his entry into the single leg, he originally had his head on the inside, and that's where exactly you want it. You don't want it on the outside. If it's on the outside here, on the single leg, the choke can happen. If it's on the inside, it's much more difficult. But Oliveira made a nice adjustment where he pushed ahead and eventually got it on the outside. Now, once he got that on the outside, Kevin Lee had to either fight the hands and just try to get out of there, or make sure Oliveira didn't pull guard, because once he pulled guard, it was pretty much game over, especially because Oliveira had that high wrist guillotine. It was beautiful. So I'd say normally no, but if we continue to see something like that where he leaves his head in a position where it shouldn't be and he doesn't make the right adjustments immediately after to get out of there, then we could say yes. Tyler Oleknisk asks, do you think the coronavirus is going to stop Khabib versus Ferguson? Yeah, I do. I mean, it's unfortunate to say because I really want to see it, but from a public health point of view, I just think the rate in which we're seeing these cases, the government are going to just put a stop on all sporting events. It's going to be too much. Andy Copland asks, what's next for Kevin Lee is the obvious question, because I don't even think he knows. So yeah, I think this is a major crossroads for Kevin Lee, because in his last fight before the Charles Oliveira fight, he got that huge win over Gregor Gillespie with that beautiful head kick, and you can't take that performance away from him. But what we saw in that fight was a quick finish, and we knew Kevin Lee could do that. But now with the Charles Oliveira fight, we saw 3 rounds where Kevin Lee was probably already gassing within a round and a half, and he also missed weight. And if you watched last week's podcast, you would have heard me say that I don't think the Kevin Lee weight cutting issue is in the past. Just because he made it previously in his last fight, I don't think it was in the past, and that was borne out when he missed weight for this fight. One thing I did see, and I'm not sure everyone's saying this, but Kevin Lee said that it may be a few years before he returns after that loss. And man, I know Kevin Lee is young, but a few years out isn't great, so we'll see what happens with him. I'm not sure what's next, but I'm still convinced that lightweight isn't his best weight class. I think 170 is. Obviously, if 165 existed or 160 or whatever, that would be probably his best weight class. But yeah, 170 for me. Alistair Rowe, with Maia having his farewell fight next, do you think they'll go with Cowboy or Sanchez or even someone else? Yeah, so I'm a big Damian Maia fan. It was tough seeing him lose that fight, especially by KO. And to be honest, I know a lot of people thought it was an early stoppage. I thought it was fine. I think it could have been stopped after he dropped initially, because if you go rewatch it, as far as I remember, his head did bounce off the canvas. Maybe he went out for a minute. I don't know. I was fine with the stoppage anyway. But who should he fight next? Man, it's difficult. I'm not really sure what's for Maia next. I mean, I liked the Ben Askren fight in terms of the fight that was made. I know it turned into a weird striking match, but I liked that they were 2 grapplers and they were trying to prove who the best grappler was. Maybe something similar, maybe another grappler. That's something I'd like to see. SDFBF asks, how bad is it in Ireland now? Here in Norway, they've closed the airports, borders, schools, everything. So yeah, it's pretty bad. We're similar to your situation, but not exactly the same. So far they have closed the schools. There are a lot of flights that are getting cancelled, but it's not completely closed, as in the airport isn't. The St. Paddy's Day parade, of course, has been cancelled. I think right now it's gatherings of only 100 people or less. Pubs have been closed ahead of Paddy's Day, and a lot of people are working from home where possible. So I'm working from home right now for the foreseeable. So it's not put a complete lockdown on the country, but we're not far off, and to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if we got close to that. It's a bit crazy. And then we had some comments from people just saying stay safe, which is always nice to hear, and thank you too. Hopefully you and your family stay safe. And then questions about the podcast and what's going to happen and whether we can do it. And as I said, we're going to try to do something. I've just done this. Maybe I'll do more videos like this. Maybe we can do a live chat. Again, let us know in the comments below, and like this video, subscribe, all that jazz. Cheers.